Smoke curled into the dim light of the Brentwood estate, twisting like some silent witness to horror. A house that had once been filled with laughter, with the subtle, comforting rhythm of everyday life, had become something unrecognizable. By the time anyone realized it, tragedy had struck twice. Rob Reiner, the famed actor and director, 78 years old, and Michelle Reiner, 70, were found lifeless inside their sprawling $13.5 million home, brutally stabbed, violently silenced. And yet, even as the police scoured the mansion for answers, even as neighbors whispered in disbelief, an even more unsettling event was unfolding behind the estate's closed doors. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. Imagine walking into the house where your parents have just been discovered dead, and moments later, you find smoke in a room. Not the smoke of a fireplace or a candle, but the acrid, choking kind that rises from a fire meant to destroy. In that fire, the belongings of the deceased were being reduced to ash. Personal effects, cherished items, perhaps even clues to the violence that had just occurred. And standing there, frozen, is Jake Reiner, one of their children, caught between grief and horror. Why would someone set fire to their own family's possessions in the wake of unimaginable tragedy? Was it panic, anger, or something darker? A calculated attempt to erase evidence, memories, or the truth itself? The questions swirl, but there are no easy answers. Not yet. Not until the smoke settles. From the very first seconds of this shocking tale, the audience must confront a chilling reality. Families are complicated, and tragedy often brings out not just grief but the raw, unfiltered edges of human nature. Rob and Michelle Reiner were more than the public knew. Parents, grandparents, and siblings within a network of complicated familial relationships. And in the wake of their deaths, those relationships would be tested in ways no one could have predicted. Reports say the bodies were discovered by Romy Reiner, 27, the daughter, who, in the immediate chaos, allegedly warned police about a dangerous family member. It is a statement that would echo throughout the investigation, hinting at tensions simmering beneath the polished surfaces of the Reiner family. Who could she have met? And why had those dangers been hidden in plain sight? It was a warning that would become more than just words. It would become a lens through which the aftermath of this tragedy was seen. But even as investigators tried to piece together the sequence of events, another drama was unfolding. Behind the estate's locked doors, another child, Jake, stumbled upon a scene that seemed pulled from a nightmare. Tracy Reiner, another member of the family, allegedly standing over a fire, burning items that had belonged to Rob. To witness such an act, moments after discovering the death of your parents, is a trauma most cannot comprehend. And yet, that is exactly what Jake allegedly experienced, a betrayal so intimate, so immediate, it threatens to eclipse the tragedy itself. The items being burned, personal letters, photographs, perhaps objects that held stories of decades, were more than things. They were memories, fragments of life, and possibly evidence. With each crackle and pop of the flames, a piece of history was disappearing. And Jake, frozen, struggled to process not only the loss of his parents but the unsettling realization that someone he knew, someone trusted, could commit an act of such shocking disregard. At this moment, the audience might wonder, how does a family go from normalcy to horror in just one night? What unseen tensions had been building, simmering quietly beneath polite smiles and family dinners? The answer, of course, lies in layers of complexity, secrets, and conflicts that had never reached public attention until now. And then there is Romy. Reports suggest that she was the first to alert authorities not only to the deaths, but to suspicions about the family. She allegedly spoke of a family member who was dangerous. Words that in retrospect seem eerily prophetic. The warning she offered is more than just a plot point. It frames the entire narrative of the Reiner household in the days following the murders. It forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about loyalty, protection, and the lines we cross when fear and grief collide. The media has already framed parts of the story. The dramatic deaths of Rob and Michelle Reiner, the arrest of their son Nick, the public fascination with Hollywood families in crisis. But within the estate itself, there are events that the cameras did not catch, moments that remain largely private, yet are crucial for understanding the story in its full, harrowing scope. The alleged burning of Rob Reiner's belongings is one of those moments, intimate, shocking, and full of questions that cannot be answered easily. For the audience, this introduction is a doorway into a story that promises to be as gripping as it is tragic. The smoke-filled room, the burned belongings, the horror etched into the faces of children who should have been safe in their own home. These are images that linger. They are designed not merely to shock, but to provoke thought, to make viewers question how far grief, fear, and desperation can push ordinary people into extraordinary acts. Consider the human element. Jake Reiner, confronted with a scene no child should ever witness, must navigate a labyrinth of emotions: shock, anger, betrayal, and grief. How does one process seeing a sibling or family member destroy what remains of the parents who were just violently taken? How does one balance the instinct to protect, the instinct to mourn, and the instinct to act? And what does this say about the fragility of family bonds when tested under pressure? And then, there is the tension of timing. Reports indicate that this fire did not happen before the discovery of the bodies, nor was it a spontaneous reaction in the days immediately after. It was deliberate, it was focused, and it was performed in a moment when every second counted for investigators. That timing, whether intentional or instinctual, elevates the act from a personal outburst to a potential key piece in a puzzle that authorities, the family, and the public are all desperate to solve. The emotional stakes are staggering. We are not simply watching the destruction of objects. We are witnessing the unraveling of trust, the fracturing of family, and the collision of grief with suspicion. The Reiner estate, once a place of comfort and connection, has become a landscape of fear and uncertainty. Every creaking floorboard, every door slammed shut, every whispered conversation carries weight. And as the story unfolds, the audience will feel as though they are moving through that estate alongside Jake and Romy, experiencing every tense moment firsthand. So, why does this story matter now? Because in the wake of tragedy, we often think the events that follow are peripheral. The media coverage tends to focus on arrests, court appearances, and sensationalized headlines. But the private moments, the ones that happen in smoke-filled rooms, in the glare of betrayal, in hushed conversations about what could have been, these are the moments that reveal the truth of human behavior. These are the moments that challenge us to think about loyalty, morality, and the choices we make when everything we know is shattered. And just when the audience begins to process the weight of it all, just when the mind begins to wrestle with grief and betrayal, the narrative pauses, leaving one crucial question hanging in the air. What else was destroyed in that fire? What was lost forever? And what secrets did the flames consume before anyone could see them? The answer, as we will explore chapter by chapter, is anything but simple. Each moment following the discovery of Rob and Michelle Reiner's bodies reveals more layers. Layers of tension, of fear, of hidden conflicts, that paint a portrait of a family in crisis. Jake's confrontation with the fire is just the opening salvo in a series of events that will shock, bewilder, and emotionally grip the audience. By the time Chapter 1 begins, viewers will already be invested. They have seen the horror, felt the tension, and understood that this is not just a story of crime, but a story of family, loss, and the corrosive power of secrets. The stage is set. The smoke lingers, and the question remains: who will stand by the truth, and who will let it burn? The introduction closes with a final, haunting thought, one that will carry the audience into the next chapter. The fire may have consumed objects, memories, and evidence, but it cannot erase the shock, the betrayal, or the questions that now hang over the Reiner family like a cloud. And yet, what comes next, the confrontations, the revelations, the emotional fractures, will change everything, and no one could have seen it coming. The night started like any other in the upscale Brentwood enclave. The air was cool, tinged with the faint scent of jasmine from the meticulously manicured gardens. Inside the Reiner estate, life was supposed to carry on with a sense of calm familiarity. Rob Reiner and Michelle Reiner, though in their late 70s, maintained a household that balanced Hollywood prestige with family intimacy. But by the time the evening darkened into night, that familiar rhythm would be violently shattered. leaving chaos and grief in its wake. Imagine being the first person to discover something that no one should ever see. Romy Reiner, the daughter, 27, would reportedly stumble upon this horror, her life changing in an instant. The estate, usually a sanctuary, became a site of unimaginable violence. Rob and Michelle were found stabbed in what police later described as a shocking and brutal attack. But the initial moments of discovery were disorienting, fragmented, almost surreal, the way traumatic memories often are. The story of that night is more than the crime itself. It's about how ordinary routines can be interrupted by extraordinary events, and how those interruptions can reveal not only tragedy, but the hidden dynamics of a family. In these first hours, the Reiners' private life collided with public scrutiny, creating a tension that no one in that household could have anticipated. The police report, as compiled from initial interviews, paints a picture of frantic activity. Officers described Romy as visibly shaken, her voice trembling as she recounted what she had seen. Her statements contained a curious, chilling element, a warning about a dangerous family member who should be a suspect. The words hung in the air, enigmatic and foreboding. At that moment, even before the investigation had fully unfolded, the seeds of suspicion were planted. As investigators worked the scene, the estate revealed more than just the tragedy of 2 lives ended. It showed signs of tension, of disruption, of a household caught in a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Friends and neighbors reported hearing nothing at first, the quiet punctuated only by the distant wail of sirens and the low hum of media helicopters arriving to capture the scene. Inside, the family members were trying to navigate their shock, each grappling with grief and disbelief in their own way. Romy's discovery of the bodies marked the first turning point in a night that would redefine the Reiner family. She had been in the house for routine reasons, unaware that her world was about to be upended. The initial moments of horror are difficult to articulate. The confusion, the instinctive fight-or-flight reaction, the dissonance between what one expects to see in a family home and the brutal reality confronting her. For Romy, this night would become a memory etched in terror and disbelief. The narrative that night is complicated not just by the violence, but by the conflicting emotions among the surviving family members. Nick Reiner, the son, lived in the guest house on the property. Within hours, he was arrested on suspicion of 2 counts of first-degree murder. But the story did not end with a simple narrative of guilt and punishment. It spiraled into a series of tensions, confrontations, and revelations that exposed fault lines within the family. Immediately following the discovery, investigators described a chaotic scene. Emergency responders moved carefully through the estate, noting the presence of personal items, evidence, and a family in shock. Statements were collected, rooms were documented, and the Reiners' home, a space meant for security and comfort, became a tableau of grief and procedural scrutiny. The weight of that night was magnified by the public's fascination. The Reiners were not an ordinary family. They carried the visibility of Hollywood prominence, which means every gesture, every word, every tear would be scrutinized. The media coverage began almost immediately, focusing on the murders themselves, but the deeper story, the fractures within the family, the private confrontations, the emotional fallout, remained largely hidden. For Jake Reiner, who would later witness another layer of horror with the burning of his father's belongings, the night marked a transformation. It was no longer simply about mourning. It became about confronting a new reality where trust, grief, and suspicion collided. Each family member would be forced to navigate this delicate balance differently, and the decisions made in those early hours would ripple throughout the weeks and months to come. The shock of discovering a loved one's death cannot be overstated. The initial response is instinctual, disbelief, denial, and a desperate search for rationality in a situation that defies logic. For Romy, those instincts collided with the stark reality of what she found, pushing her into a position where she had to act quickly, to inform authorities, and to process a trauma that would haunt her. There were also small, seemingly mundane details that later gained significance. Doors left unlocked, lights left on or off, items slightly out of place. Every element of the household became a potential clue, a point of contention, or a trigger for memory. Investigators would catalog these details meticulously, but for the family living through it, each minor observation carried emotional weight far beyond its practical relevance. What makes this night particularly compelling is the interplay between public and private perception. Outsiders saw a headline: Rob and Michelle Reiner stabbed to death. But inside the estate, each second was imbued with confusion, fear, and emotional complexity. Who to trust? Who to confide in? How does one process grief when surrounded by suspicion? These questions frame the night and set the stage for events that would escalate in unexpected ways. Moreover, Romy's early warning about a dangerous family member added a layer of tension that would linger. It suggested that beneath the surface of this family, there were pre-existing conflicts, resentments, and possibly hidden motives. This warning, while not fully understood at the time, became a lens through which investigators, media, and family members interpreted subsequent events. The narrative of that night is also a story of movement, the movement of people, of emotions, of suspicion. Police officers navigated hallways, scanning for evidence. Family members moved from room to room, trying to understand what had happened, often speaking in hushed tones. Emotions fluctuated between disbelief and fear, between sorrow and anger. In such moments, ordinary routines are impossible, replaced by a tense choreography of survival and emotional processing. As dawn approached, the estate had changed irrevocably. The presence of law enforcement, the media scrutiny, and the weight of grief created a charged atmosphere, one that would be amplified in the coming days. For Jake and Romy, this was only the beginning. They had witnessed the unthinkable, and soon they would encounter yet another horror, one that threatened not only memories but the integrity of the home itself. The night, seemingly over with the discovery and arrest, was far from concluded. In the hours that followed, the Reiners would face a new series of shocks, confrontations, emotional breakdowns, and allegations that would continue to challenge the family's cohesion. It was a night that redefined what it meant to be a Reiner. A night when grief collided with suspicion, when the ordinary became terrifying, and when the foundation of trust within a family began to fracture. And just when it seemed the night could not become more surreal, another event would unfold that left even the most composed family members horrified. Jake Reiner, navigating the estate in the wake of his parents' deaths, would encounter smoke rising from a room, flames consuming what remained of Rob Reiner's personal belongings. The sight was incomprehensible, not only a physical fire but a symbolic eruption of anger, fear, and betrayal. Imagine standing in the shadow of death, moments after discovering your parents have been violently taken from you, and realizing that someone you trusted may be the danger they warned you about. That was reportedly the position Romy Reiner found herself in on that fateful night. In the chaos following the discovery of Rob and Michelle Reiner's bodies, a statement she allegedly made to police would later reverberate through every layer of the investigation, a cryptic warning about a dangerous family member. At first, it might seem almost absurd, the very idea that a loved one could be capable of harm. Families are supposed to be safe havens, but grief has a way of stripping away illusions. It reveals fractures and hidden tensions that may have been invisible under the surface of polite dinners, family gatherings, or public appearances. Romy's warning was not just a casual remark. It was a premonition, a signal that something within the family had already been simmering, waiting for a moment to erupt. Police reports later indicated that Romy appeared shaken, her voice tight with a mixture of fear, disbelief, and urgency. She reportedly described behaviors and past incidents that she considered threatening, patterns that might have seemed minor to outsiders, but, in the context of the tragedy, became deeply concerning. The officers listening had to balance the shock of the murders with the credibility of her warning. How does one process a cautionary statement amid one of the most emotionally charged circumstances imaginable? What makes her warning so significant is that it was delivered before the chaos of the fire, before Jake would confront the shocking act of someone burning Rob Reiner's belongings. It was the first glimpse into a complex narrative of suspicion and possible motive. In the hours that followed, investigators would have to reconcile Romy's words with what they were seeing, collecting evidence while navigating the murky waters of family relationships and emotional trauma. The warning also underscores the psychological burden carried by family members in moments like these. Imagine being tasked not only with processing grief, but also with identifying potential threats within your own family. It's a responsibility that no one should bear, yet in families where tensions run deep, such roles can fall on those who are most perceptive or most attuned to warning signs. Romy, in this case, was placed squarely in that position. As the night unfolded, Romy's warning set a tone of vigilance and suspicion. Investigators would continue to piece together timelines, collect statements, and examine evidence. But within the walls of the Reiner estate, the emotional stakes were just beginning to rise. Grief, fear, and uncertainty created a charged environment in which even small actions could have profound implications. And then came the fire, a scene so surreal it could only happen in the aftermath of extraordinary tragedy. Jake Reiner, navigating the estate in his own state of shock, noticed smoke curling up from a room, the acrid smell unmistakable. He approached cautiously, only to find Tracy Reiner allegedly standing over flames, burning the belongings of Rob Reiner. It was an act that seemed almost cinematic in its audacity, yet it was horrifyingly real. The warning Romy had delivered earlier now took on a chilling resonance. The dangerous family member she mentioned. The premonition of threat within the household seemed, in retrospect, linked to this shocking act of destruction. But the layers of ambiguity remained. Was it intentional, impulsive, or an emotional response to grief? Was it symbolic, or was it more sinister? The questions were almost unbearable in their complexity. This moment, the fire, the warning, the collision of grief and suspicion, underscores the central tension of the Reiner narrative. It is a story not only of tragedy, but of human behavior under pressure, of the choices people make when boundaries are blurred, when emotions run high, and when the stakes are immeasurably high. And as the hours stretched on, the family found themselves navigating a world where trust had eroded, where suspicion had taken root, and where every action could carry profound consequences. By the time dawn approached, it was clear that Romy's warning had not been just a momentary thought or an overreaction in shock. It was a lens through which the unfolding drama could be understood, a subtle, haunting prelude to a series of events that would challenge the family in ways no one could have predicted. The warning had set the stage, framing the narrative in terms of suspicion, fear, and the uneasy intersection of grief and revelation. And just when it seemed the situation could not become more tense, the implications of the warning began to intersect with new discoveries, private confrontations, and public scrutiny. Every choice, every revelation, every whispered conversation had the potential to reshape the story. For the Reiners, the night of the murders was not just a single event. It was the beginning of a chain reaction that would leave scars, emotional, relational, and psychological, that might never fully heal. But what came next would escalate the tension even further. A moment of confrontation, a scene of destruction, and a shocking display that would redefine everything the family thought they knew about each other. And no one, not even the most perceptive sibling, saw it coming. The concept of justice is supposed to be clear, black and white. Someone commits a crime, law enforcement investigates, and the guilty are held accountable. But in the world of tragedy and family dynamics, the lines blur. For the Reiners, the arrest that followed the deaths of Rob and Michelle Reiner did not just signal the start of a legal process. It ripped the family apart in ways that would echo for years. Nick Reiner, 32, son of Rob and Michelle, was arrested that very night on 2 counts of first-degree murder. The headline alone was enough to shock the public. The son of 2 murdered parents, taken into custody amid a swirl of grief, speculation, and media scrutiny. But the arrest was more than a legal action. It became an emotional earthquake for the family, a sudden rupture in their already fragile world. Imagine the horror of being Jake or Romy, standing in a house still smelling faintly of violence and fear, when law enforcement announces that your brother is being taken into custody. Your parents are dead, your world has been upended, and suddenly the person closest to you is now the center of suspicion. That moment, as witnesses described, was a surreal collision of grief, disbelief, and disbelief. How could someone you grew up with, someone you shared family holidays and childhood memories with, be accused of such a horrific act? The arrest process itself was clinical but brutal in its impact. Officers reportedly moved methodically through the estate, taking Nick into custody while family members looked on, trapped between shock and the instinct to intervene. The procedural nature of the arrest, reading of rights, handcuffing, the careful documentation, stood in stark contrast to the chaos of emotions swirling around. To outsiders, it may have looked like a routine procedure. To those inside the house, it was a moment that crystallized the horror of everything that had just happened. From a legal standpoint, the arrest was swift, perhaps surprisingly so. Nick was charged on the basis of evidence collected that night and in the immediate aftermath, though what that evidence was exactly remains largely undisclosed publicly. In families, however, the legal narrative is only one part of the story. The emotional impact often overshadows facts, and for Jake and Romy, every detail was filtered through layers of personal pain and suspicion. One of the most compelling aspects of the arrest is the way it reframed the family's understanding of itself. Suddenly, old tensions, unresolved conflicts, and subtle resentments were illuminated in harsh light. Parents who once seemed distant or enigmatic were gone, leaving behind a vacuum filled with suspicion and hurt. Siblings, who had previously relied on each other for support, now found themselves questioning everything: intentions, motives, and even memories of shared experiences. Media scrutiny amplified every aspect of this tragedy. Journalists and reporters descended on the Brentwood estate, capturing every visible expression of grief, every whispered conversation caught on camera. The family's private mourning became public spectacle, and the arrest became the focal point. News cycles highlighted the sensational aspects: Nick as a suspect, the wealth and prominence of the Reiners, the shocking nature of the deaths. But the human complexity, the private horror experienced by Jake and Romy, was largely invisible. For Nick himself, the arrest was a rupture between public and private identity. In one moment, he was a son, a sibling, a human being grappling with loss. In the next, he was the accused, the focus of a criminal investigation that would dominate his life. The duality of those roles, family member and suspect, creates an almost unbearable tension, particularly when the surrounding family members are themselves struggling to process grief and fear. Jake Reiner reportedly experienced a mix of disbelief, anger, and confusion. How does one reconcile the image of a brother you know intimately with the reality of someone charged with killing your parents? The arrest shattered not only trust, but a sense of safety that no one in the family could have anticipated losing. Even mundane interactions, shared memories, family routines, conversations about the past, became fraught with suspicion. Every glance, every action could be interpreted as a potential clue, a hidden motive, or a warning sign. And yet, in the midst of this chaos, the family still had to navigate practical realities. Legal representation, media statements, and communication with law enforcement became unavoidable obligations. Each decision carried emotional weight. Choosing to speak publicly risked inflaming tensions. Remaining silent risked allowing speculation to fill the void. For Jake and Romy, these choices were impossible to make without confronting the rawness of their grief. The arrest also brought into focus the public fascination with Hollywood tragedy. There is a peculiar intensity when celebrities or high-profile families face extreme events. Every expression, every statement, every silence becomes fodder for speculation. Headlines emphasized scandal and sensationalism, sometimes overshadowing the very human pain that the family was experiencing. This dual pressure, legal scrutiny and public judgment, compounded the emotional stress and isolation of those directly affected. In private, however, the consequences were immediate and tangible. Jake and Romy reportedly began to see fractures in relationships that had once seemed stable. Disagreements over how to handle the investigation, how to protect themselves emotionally, and how to interpret Nick's alleged involvement created tension that compounded the already unbearable grief. Small conflicts, once easily managed, became flashpoints for deeper issues. Psychologists studying trauma often note that sudden arrests within the family can trigger a complex web of emotional responses. Shock and denial are common first reactions, followed by anger, guilt, and fear. For siblings, the emotional fallout is often magnified because they must simultaneously process grief and reassess trust within the family unit. Every memory, every shared experience, suddenly becomes a point of reflection, an attempt to make sense of how someone you thought you knew could be capable of such violence. The arrest also created a ripple effect on family narratives. Stories that had been held privately, about behavior, relationships, or unresolved conflicts, began to surface in public statements, legal documents, and media reports. Each revelation added complexity to an already volatile situation. For Jake and Romy, reconciling these narratives with their own lived experiences became an emotional minefield. And while the arrest ostensibly addressed legal accountability, it did nothing to alleviate the deeper emotional wounds. Trust had been ruptured, grief intensified, and the sense of family security evaporated. Each sibling was left to navigate a reality in which the line between victim and suspect, love and suspicion, grief and anger, had become painfully blurred. The arrest was more than a procedural step. It was a turning point that defined the trajectory of the Reiner family in the weeks and months to come. It was a catalyst that would expose latent conflicts, reveal hidden tensions, and ultimately set the stage for even more shocking events. Within days, new confrontations, private disputes, and acts of destruction, such as the burning of Rob Reiner's belongings, would compound the emotional chaos introduced that night. And yet, despite the arrest, the story was far from over. The legal process, media coverage, and public curiosity were only part of a much deeper, more personal drama unfolding behind closed doors. Jake Reiner, already grappling with the immediate aftermath, would soon face another moment that would redefine his understanding of family, trust, and grief. Because what came next would be both literal and symbolic. A fire consuming what remained of Rob Reiner's life and memories, a conflagration that mirrored the emotional devastation of a family already shattered by loss. And no one, not even those closest to the events, could predict the scale of the storm that was about to unfold. The Reiner estate was no longer a home, not in any meaningful sense. After the deaths of Rob and Michelle Reiner, the sprawling $13.5 million Brentwood mansion, once a place of laughter, casual conversation, and the hum of daily life, had become a charged, almost haunted space. For the surviving children, particularly Jake and Romy, the estate represented a paradox, a sanctuary that had been violated, a private world now both intimate and terrifying, a space where grief, fear, and suspicion converged. It's difficult to overstate the emotional weight of returning to a house where parents have been brutally murdered. Every hallway, every room, every corner carries echoes of what was lost. The air itself seems heavier, saturated with the remnants of violence, the scent of death, and the unspoken fear that something is fundamentally broken. For Jake and Romy, the estate was a place where they could no longer feel safe, a constant reminder that the familiar can become a landscape of trauma in a single night. Life inside the estate after the tragedy was complicated. It was not merely about surviving. It was about navigating the competing imperatives of mourning, preserving memory, and assessing threat. Romy reportedly spent much of the first hours moving from room to room, trying to make sense of what she had seen, attempting to piece together fragments of understanding in the wake of devastation. Jake, meanwhile, was caught between the need to process his own grief and the instinct to protect his remaining sense of family integrity. Every detail inside the house became a focal point for anxiety. Doors left open or shut, drawers slightly ajar, items displaced, all carried amplified significance. In moments of heightened grief, the smallest anomalies become symbolic. The family, already fractured by loss and suspicion, found themselves hyper-aware of their surroundings, constantly assessing potential dangers both tangible and emotional. Access to different areas of the estate became a source of tension. Nick's guest house, where he had been living, was now a locus of suspicion. The family reportedly debated who should be allowed where, who should interact with whom, and how to maintain boundaries without exacerbating conflict. Every decision, no matter how mundane, was imbued with emotional and symbolic weight. Observers would later describe a household on edge. Whispered conversations in hallways, quiet confrontations over trivial matters that suddenly felt monumental, and a pervasive atmosphere of fear and distrust. Every sibling navigated the trauma differently. Romy, still processing the immediate horror of discovering the bodies, reportedly oscillated between tears, anger, and moments of stunned silence. Jake, witnessing both the grief of his sister and the suspicious actions of other family members, struggled to maintain composure while internally processing the complexity of what he was seeing. The estate itself, usually a place of warmth and comfort, now served as a backdrop for a psychological minefield. Every interaction had the potential to trigger confrontation or revelation. Family members became intensely self-aware, their words and actions scrutinized by each other. The dynamic that had previously been ordinary, casual joking, shared meals, routine chores, became fraught with tension, laden with meaning that may not have existed before. External observers could not fully grasp the intensity of life inside the estate. While media coverage focused on arrests, public speculation, and sensationalized accounts of the murders, the lived experience of the family was a complex interplay of fear, grief, and strategic navigation of relationships. The psychological toll was immense, as siblings attempted to maintain semblances of normalcy while simultaneously negotiating the emotional minefield left in the wake of their parents' deaths. Amid this tension, small, seemingly trivial actions assumed outsized significance. A misplaced photograph, a room left unlocked, or the absence of certain personal effects became points of emotional focus. These details, often overlooked by outsiders, carried symbolic and practical importance within the family. They became markers of trust, loyalty, and suspicion, and contributed to the growing sense of instability within the estate. The emotional intensity was compounded by the presence of investigators. Law enforcement officials moved through the estate with purpose, documenting rooms, cataloging evidence, and collecting statements. Their presence, while necessary for the investigation, added another layer of stress. Family members were forced to navigate not only their own grief, but also the scrutiny of professionals whose sole focus was determining facts, not providing comfort. Within this environment, the foundation of family relationships began to shift. Siblings who had previously shared trust and camaraderie found themselves questioning intentions and motives. Moments of private grief collided with public responsibility, creating friction that was both subtle and explosive. Every interaction became a negotiation between loyalty to one another and the instinct for self-preservation. And then there were the moments that defied anticipation, the unexpected triggers of conflict that revealed deeper fractures. Jake reportedly began noticing small but telling behaviors. Furtive movements, hushed conversations, and subtle gestures that hinted at hidden agendas. The family's grief, already raw, was now intersecting with fear, suspicion, and the emerging realization that not all threats came from outside the household. The estate itself became a psychological arena. Each room, each corridor, and each common space served as a stage for drama, confrontation, and revelation. Ordinary tasks, preparing food, moving furniture, tending to household needs, became fraught with symbolic meaning, as actions were interpreted through the lens of grief and suspicion. The ordinary became extraordinary. The familiar became threatening. Every day inside the estate revealed additional layers of tension. Family members were forced to interact in constrained spaces, unable to escape one another emotionally or physically. Privacy was limited, and the constant presence of investigators, combined with media scrutiny, created a claustrophobic atmosphere. Grief became performative, suspicion became pervasive, and emotional reactions were magnified to the point where even minor disagreements could escalate into significant conflicts. It was in this environment, charged with fear and grief, that Jake would first notice smoke curling through the hallway, a moment that would shock him to the core. The estate, already a site of emotional turbulence, became the stage for an act that seemed both surreal and terrifying. Tracy Reiner allegedly burning Rob Reiner's belongings. The sight was more than disturbing. It was a symbolic eruption, a literal manifestation of the chaos that had consumed the household. In the days following the discovery of the murders, life inside the estate was a delicate balancing act between mourning and vigilance. Siblings navigated grief while simultaneously managing suspicion and fear. Every conversation, every movement, and every decision carried significance far beyond what it would have before. The home, which had once been a place of security and comfort, had transformed into a psychological crucible, testing the bonds between family members and exposing vulnerabilities that might otherwise have remained hidden. And just when it seemed the intensity of daily life inside the estate had reached its peak, a new layer of shock emerged. One that would escalate emotional stakes and leave an indelible mark on Jake and Romy. The burning of Rob Reiner's belongings was not only an act of destruction, but a harbinger of conflict, distrust, and emotional fracture that no family member could have predicted. But what came next would push the estate from a site of mourning to a stage for confrontation, a moment where grief and anger collided, and where the Reiners would be forced to confront not only their loss but the unsettling actions of one of their own. And no one was prepared for the consequences. But what came next would push the estate from a site of mourning to a stage for confrontation, a moment where grief and anger collided, and where the Reiners would be forced to confront not only their loss but the unsettling actions of one of their own. And no one was prepared for the consequences. The first time Jake Reiner noticed it, the smell was subtle, almost imperceptible. It was the kind of odor that could easily be mistaken for a leftover candle, a faint whiff of charred wood from the fireplace, or the remnants of a small kitchen accident. But something about it felt wrong, sharp, acrid, and out of place in the stillness of the Brentwood estate. At that moment, he didn't yet understand the full implications, but instinctively, he knew that it demanded investigation. Imagine being in a home where the air itself seems heavy with grief. Every step is measured, every sound amplified, every shadow carries meaning. Jake had been moving through the halls of the estate for hours, still processing the unimaginable: his parents brutally stabbed, the sudden arrest of his brother Nick, and the pervasive tension that had begun to settle over the household like a thick fog. And now, a new, unsettling sensory cue: smoke. The smell grew stronger as he approached a room at the far end of the main hallway. It was unmistakable now. The sharp sting of burning materials, the chemical bite of paper and fabric turned to ash. Panic and disbelief collided in his chest. What could possibly be on fire at a time like this? Had an accident started a blaze in the already fragile environment of the estate? Or, worse, was someone deliberately destroying something? As Jake moved closer, his mind raced. His emotions were a turbulent storm of grief, confusion, and rising alarm. Who would set something on fire in a house still reeling from murder? And why? Every instinct screamed that he should call someone, that this was beyond his capacity to manage alone. And yet, he was drawn forward, propelled by a mix of curiosity, fear, and the desperate need to understand what was happening in the place that had been his sanctuary. The door to the room was partially ajar. Smoke curled out like thin fingers, winding into the hall and choking the senses. Jake hesitated, taking a deep breath to steady himself. Every nerve in his body was on high alert. The house, which had moments before been quiet except for the muted sounds of conversation and footsteps, now seemed alive with danger. He could feel it, the tension, the fear, the raw emotional energy emanating from what lay beyond that door. Peering inside, Jake saw it: Tracy Reiner, standing over a small fire, methodically feeding it with items that had once belonged to Rob Reiner. Letters, photographs, papers, and possibly personal artifacts were being consumed in flames, their smoke curling upward, filling the room with the bitter, metallic scent of destruction. The act was both deliberate and controlled, a stark contrast to the chaotic grief that had engulfed the estate in the previous hours. Shock rooted Jake to the spot. He couldn't reconcile the image before him with his understanding of family loyalty and grief. In moments like these, logic and emotion collide, creating a paralysis that is as physical as it is psychological. He was torn between confronting Tracy, fleeing for help, or trying to process the magnitude of what he was witnessing. Every instinct screamed that this was wrong, yet the enormity of the moment left him frozen, a silent observer to an act that seemed almost unreal. The items in the fire were more than just belongings. Each photograph and letter carried memories, pieces of history, and fragments of identity. As they turned to ash, Jake realized that something vital, a tangible connection to the parents they had just lost, was being erased. The act was both literal and symbolic, a destruction of material possessions and a potential obliteration of evidence or memory. The implications for the family, for investigators, and for the narrative of that night were staggering. In that moment, Jake experienced a surge of conflicting emotions. Anger flared at the perceived betrayal. Fear gripped him at the uncertainty of what might be revealed or concealed through this act. Grief intensified, fueled by the realization that even the remnants of his parents' lives were now under threat. And beneath all of it, a profound sense of disbelief. How could someone act with such detachment in the wake of unimaginable tragedy? He took a tentative step forward, the floorboards creaking underfoot. The sound seemed deafening in the heavy silence, as if the house itself was reacting to the intrusion. Tracy looked up briefly, her face unreadable, then returned her attention to the fire. There was no overt aggression, no explanation offered, no acknowledgement of the emotional storm unfolding just beyond the flames. The act was methodical, almost ritualistic, and the psychological impact on Jake was immediate and severe. Every second felt elongated, stretched by the intensity of the moment. The fire crackled, the smoke thickened, and the smell of burning paper and fabric filled Jake's lungs. He struggled to reconcile what he was witnessing with his memories of family life, birthdays, holidays, quiet moments in the living room. How had the home that once held warmth, laughter, and safety become a site of emotional and symbolic destruction? The psychological complexity of this moment cannot be understated. Jake was forced to confront not only the grief of losing his parents, but also the betrayal implicit in the deliberate destruction of their belongings. The act challenged his understanding of family loyalty, morality, and the boundaries of acceptable behavior. Every instinct in him screamed that intervention was necessary, yet the gravity of the situation, combined with shock and fear, created a paralysis that is common in moments of extreme stress. The fire also carried broader implications. Investigators arriving later would have to consider whether the destruction of these items constituted interference with evidence, an attempt to erase history, or an emotionally driven act of grief and anger. For the family, it became a focal point of tension, suspicion, and conflict. The smoke was a tangible manifestation of the chaos and uncertainty that had overtaken the estate, a visual and olfactory representation of a household under siege from both internal and external pressures. Jake reportedly tried to speak, his voice quivering as he asked questions that went unanswered. The act continued, deliberate and steady, the flames consuming letters, photographs, and papers with relentless efficiency. Each piece of material that vanished into smoke was a memory, a fragment of history, a connection to parents who had been violently taken. The emotional stakes were extraordinary, a mix of grief, anger, and the helplessness of witnessing destruction in real time. The smell of smoke, sharp and invasive, seemed to carry with it a message. Grief alone was not enough to define the night. The fire, the deliberate act, and the ambiguity of intention added layers of tension that the family had not anticipated. It was a sensory confirmation that the tragedy was not limited to death alone. The very identity, memory, and history of the family were under assault. And yet, amidst the chaos, a moment of clarity emerged. Jake realized that this was not a spontaneous act. It was deliberate, focused, and symbolic. The fire was a statement, a physical manifestation of grief, anger, or perhaps deeper intentions that no one could yet understand. The room, filled with smoke, became a stage on which betrayal and family tension played out in a visceral, unforgettable way. The incident left Jake shaken, his perception of family forever altered. Trust, once assumed, had been challenged in the most extreme manner. Loyalty, once unquestioned, had been tested beyond recognition. The smell of smoke, so ordinary in other contexts, had become a marker of trauma, a trigger for reflection, and a haunting reminder of how quickly the familiar can become threatening. And just when Jake thought the moment could not become more surreal, he realized that the fire was only the beginning. The flames had not only consumed material objects. They had ignited a chain reaction of suspicion, confrontation, and emotional fracture that would continue to unfold over the days, weeks, and months ahead. But what came next would push the family to the edge, forcing them to confront truths they had long avoided and setting the stage for revelations that would shock them all, and no one could have predicted the scale of what was about to occur. The fire was not just flames consuming paper and fabric. It was a symbol, a psychological detonator, a moment where grief, anger, and betrayal converged into something almost tangible. Jake Reiner, still raw from the murder of his parents, now faced a second, equally shocking trauma, watching a family member, Tracy Reiner, intentionally destroying the belongings of Rob Reiner. The fire, both literal and metaphorical, represented the collapse of trust within a household already consumed by loss. The room was thick with smoke, each inhalation burning the lungs and stinging the eyes. Flames licked the edges of letters, photographs, and personal items, turning cherished memories into blackened ash. The crackle of burning paper echoed through the otherwise silent halls, a sound that seemed almost malevolent in its persistence. Jake, frozen in disbelief, could hardly reconcile the sight before him with the home he had known all his life. In moments like these, ordinary logic fails. Jake's mind raced. Why would someone act like this now? Was it grief manifesting in a destructive form, an attempt to cope with the unthinkable? Or was it something darker, a deliberate act to erase evidence, manipulate perception, or assert control? Every possibility seemed plausible, yet none provided comfort. The fire became a mirror reflecting not only the chaos of the house, but the fractured state of the family itself. Every object in the flames carried weight. Photographs captured smiles, milestones, and quiet domestic moments. Letters held the thoughts, fears, and love of years past. The destruction of these items was more than symbolic. It was an erasure of history, a burning of tangible connections to Rob and Michelle Reiner. For Jake, the act felt like a personal violation, an assault on the memory of the parents he had just lost. The psychological impact of witnessing such an act cannot be understated. Trauma, compounded by grief, amplifies the emotional resonance of events. Jake's shock was immediate, but it quickly deepened into anger, disbelief, and a gnawing sense of betrayal. How could a sibling, a family member, engage in such an act at a moment when the household was already fractured by unimaginable violence? The fire was not just destroying objects. It was burning trust, safety, and the fragile equilibrium of the Reiner estate. Tracy Reiner, according to eyewitness accounts, moved deliberately. Each item was placed into the flames with intent. There was no hesitation, no sign of remorse in the moment. The act itself was calm, methodical, almost ritualistic, a stark contrast to the chaos and fear radiating from Jake. This contrast only heightened the emotional intensity of the scene. Here was a person, familiar and loved, acting with a detachment that defied understanding, leaving Jake caught between confrontation and paralysis. The flames cast a flickering glow, illuminating faces, walls, and objects in ways that seemed almost cinematic. Shadows danced across the room, exaggerating the drama of the moment and adding a surreal quality to an already surreal night. In that light, the destruction felt not only real but symbolic. A physical manifestation of the family's fractured state. The fire was a signal that nothing in the house, not even memories, could be taken for granted. Smoke filled the room and the hallways beyond, a pungent, choking presence that seemed to hang in the air long after the fire itself had begun. Each breath reminded Jake that this was not a dream, not a hallucination, not a misinterpretation. It was real, tangible, and happening in his home. The scent of burning paper and fabric became a psychological marker, linking memory, grief, and trauma in a way that would leave lasting impressions. Jake's instinct to intervene conflicted with a profound fear. Approaching Tracy risked confrontation. Calling for help could escalate tension. Doing nothing seemed morally impossible. Trauma often creates this kind of paralysis, a state where action is simultaneously necessary and terrifying. For Jake, the moment was a crucible. The fire tested his courage, his judgment, and his understanding of family loyalty. The implications of the fire extended beyond the immediate emotional impact. In a home under investigation for a double homicide, every act of destruction carried potential legal significance. Letters, photographs, and other belongings could contain information relevant to the investigation. The flames were not only consuming memories, but potentially evidence. A fact that added another layer of complexity and dread to an already volatile situation. As the fire burned, Jake reportedly tried to engage Tracy in conversation, his voice shaking with urgency. But she continued, seemingly unaffected by the emotional intensity, feeding items into the flames with mechanical precision. The scene was a study in contrasts. One sibling engulfed in grief, shock, and moral outrage, the other executing destruction with deliberate calm. The emotional dissonance was nearly unbearable. The fire also symbolized the collapse of the household's emotional architecture. In ordinary circumstances, family homes are safe spaces, places of memory and continuity. In the Reiner estate, the fire represented the undoing of that security. The destruction of personal belongings, items that carried the weight of history, identity, and love, signaled a rupture in the family narrative. The home, once a place of comfort, had become a theater of trauma, where grief, anger, and suspicion played out in dramatic and destructive ways. Observers might wonder, why burn these items at this specific moment? The act raises questions about timing, intention, and emotional state. Was it an attempt to cope with grief, to assert control in a world suddenly out of control, or to manipulate the perceptions of those around her? The ambiguity of motive is what makes the act so psychologically potent, leaving witnesses, especially Jake, struggling to interpret the meaning of each deliberate motion. Every second of that scene etched itself into memory. The crackling of flames, the rising smoke, the smell of burning paper, the flickering light on walls and faces, all combined into a moment of sensory and emotional intensity. Trauma psychologists note that such moments can create lasting imprints on memory, particularly when compounded by grief and betrayal. For Jake, the fire was not just an event. It became a defining moment, a lens through which he would later interpret the collapse of his family's emotional stability. The fire also foreshadowed the deeper fractures that would emerge in the following days. Trust, once assumed, had been irrevocably challenged. Family dynamics, already strained by loss, now carried the added weight of suspicion, fear, and unresolved conflict. The destruction of Rob Reiner's belongings became both a literal and symbolic turning point, setting the stage for further confrontations, revelations, and emotional upheaval within the household. And just when it seemed the intensity could not be heightened further, the consequences of the fire began to unfold. Smoke and ash were not the only remnants. The act left lingering questions, moral dilemmas, and a palpable tension that would dominate every interaction in the estate. Jake now had to navigate a home that was not only physically altered by flames, but emotionally transformed, a place where grief, suspicion, and betrayal intersected in ways that defied simple comprehension. But what came next would take the tension to an entirely new level. A confrontation that forced the family to confront not only the immediate act of destruction, but also the deeper fractures threatening to tear them apart. And no one in that room could have anticipated just how far the fallout would go. The moment of confrontation arrived like a thunderclap in the midst of already unrelenting chaos. Jake Reiner, standing in the smoky hallway of the estate, realized that hesitation was no longer an option. The flames devouring Rob Reiner's belongings were more than a destructive act. They were a challenge, a provocation, a tangible manifestation of the fractured family dynamics that had been simmering long before the tragic murders. Jake stepped forward, the floorboards creaking beneath him, every sound amplified by the heavy, smoke-filled silence. The acrid odor burned his nostrils and stung his eyes, but his attention was fixed entirely on Tracy Reiner. Her back was to him as she methodically fed papers and personal effects into the fire. The mechanical precision of her actions suggested intent beyond a simple emotional outburst. It was a calculated destruction, deliberate in its focus, and that realization sent a chill through Jake's body. "Stop," he finally shouted, his voice breaking through the crackle of flames. It was not a plea. It was a command, a desperate attempt to halt what he knew could not be undone. Tracy paused briefly, turning her head to glance at him. Her expression was unreadable, but there was no hesitation in her continued movements, no sign that the moral gravity of the act had penetrated her focus. For Jake, every second stretched into an eternity. He could feel his own pulse in his temples, the rush of adrenaline amplifying both fear and anger. How could a sibling, someone he had known his entire life, act with such detachment while the home they grew up in was still bearing the weight of unspeakable tragedy? The room, once filled with memories and warmth, had become a stage for confrontation, and the lines between grief, rage, and betrayal had blurred beyond recognition. The confrontation was not just physical, it was psychological. Each item tossed into the fire was a symbol, a fragment of identity and memory. Letters, photographs, and documents, pieces of the parents they had lost, vanished in a matter of seconds. The act was more than destruction of objects. It was an assertion of control, a declaration that chaos could be met with fire, that history could be rewritten with smoke. Jake advanced cautiously, trying to reason, to appeal to some part of Tracy that might understand the magnitude of what she was doing. "These aren't just things," he said, his voice taut with emotion. "These are Mom and Dad's memories." "Stop." But the words hung in the smoky air, met with silence, punctuated only by the relentless crackling of flames. The tension in the room escalated. Each step Jake took brought him closer to a confrontation that was as unpredictable as it was inevitable. Trauma and grief had already heightened emotional responses, making rational discussion nearly impossible. Every gesture from Tracy could be read as defiance, every silence as malice. The fire had become a battleground where the emotional stakes were higher than any physical danger could represent. As he approached, Jake's mind raced through possibilities. Should he physically intervene? Call for help? Could he stop the destruction without further inflaming the situation? The decisions were instantaneous, yet weighted with the consequences of both action and inaction.